History podcast for sleep. Why Korean scholars carried folding desks and tea sets. Story 1. The gentle scholar's life. Why Korean Confucians loved portability and tea. Section 1. The scholar in the mountains. A slow, folding life. Let's start with the year 1710. You are standing at the edge of a misty hillside in Joseon, Korea. The morning air smells faintly of pine needles and wet soil. A narrow dirt path winds up through a grove of gnarled pines. And the sound of birds, nothing urgent, just slow chirps, echoes lightly across the landscape. Somewhere ahead, behind a large granite boulder, a scholar named Yoon is quietly unfolding a desk, not a grand desk with drawers and compartments, not a heavy, lacquered piece meant to impress court officials. No, this one fits in a cloth bundle. It folds at the knees. It tucks neatly under the arm, and beside it, a low wooden tray upon which rests a tiny ceramic teapot to white glazed, cups, and a bundle of scrolls tied with string. This is not a man on the run. This is a man seeking stillness. In Joseon Dynasty, Korea, spanning from 1392 to 1897, scholars were the beating heart of society, but not in the way you might think. They weren't generals, priests, or loud political figures. They were often quiet men who spent their days studying Confucian texts, composing poetry, and searching for moral clarity in solitude. This was the time of Sayanbiya class of literati, known for their deep ethical convictions and their commitment to simplicity and introspection. They didn't hoard gold or wear silk robes unless absolutely necessary. Many of them left the bustle of cities entirely, retreating to the countryside or even to the forest, where they could reflect in peace. But even in the wilderness, a scholar needed his tools, a changsa or folding desk, often handmade from light woods like birch or pine, a rolled mat or straw cushion, writing brushes, inkstone, and black ink made from ground soot, a travel pouch of tea leaves, typically green or roasted, barley, a water vessel, and fire starting kit for boiling water. These weren't luxuries, they were extensions of the self. To write, to reflect, to sip warm tea while pondering the words of Confucius or Mencius was the soul of the Sayanbi lifestyle. Now imagine the folding desk itself. It might only come up to your knees, and when unfolded, it revealed a flat, polished surface, no larger than a standard tray table. Some were carved with delicate symbols, lotus, flowers, cranes, or trigrams from the I Ching. Others were completely plain. The point wasn't decoration, it was presence. A folding desk was a reminder. The world may be chaotic, but your study could exist anywhere. To a Korean Confucian, knowledge wasn't something locked inside stone academies. It was meant to move with Ewok, frost mountain trails, rice fields, or seaside cliffs. All you needed was a place to sit, a surface to write on, and the time to think. And then there was the tea. Tea in Joseon, Korea, was less about ritual and more about rhythm. You didn't need a 12-step ceremony. You didn't need fancy robes. You needed boiling water, a small ceramic cup, and the willingness to pause. Many scholars believed that tea sharpened the mind, soothed fatigue, and helped with digestion after a lunch of millet or pickled vegetables. The sound of pouring tea was as much a part of their writing practice as the scratching of the brush on paper. It brought warmth in winter, coolness in spring, and most importantly, a pause between thoughts. Some Seonbi wrote entire essays about tea. Others just brewed it silently while reading under a tree. You might be wondering, why were these scholars carrying their desks and kettles around? Wouldn't a house or a classroom be more convenient? Many of them rejected the trappings of status. Government service was often corrupt or bureaucratically rigid. So instead of chasing wealth or prestige, they pursued Yomchang ideal of moral clarity and humble independence. They believed in kyung, or reverence, not just for ancestors and texts, but for nature, time, and self-restraint. Their portability wasn't laziness, was philosophy. To carry only what was essential meant removing distraction. And in that simplicity, there was freedom to sit at a folding desk in the woods. Teapots steaming, ink drying slowly beside a half-written poem that, to the Seonbi, was bliss, but not. All folding desks were created equal. Some were made by local craftsmen using regional woods, while others were imported from China and cost a small fortune. How did these scholars choose what to carry? Did they decorate their desks or treat them as sacred objects? Were there arguments about which teapot shape preserved heat best? And perhaps most curiously, how did this quiet life of study and tea become so influential in Korean society even centuries later? Section 2. Carving bamboo. Brewing ideas. The scholar's tools and daily rhythms. The sun is a little higher now, warming the moss-covered rocks behind the scholar's resting spot. You notice how still everything is, not in a lifeless way, but in the way that a place becomes quiet when nothing hurries. Yun. The scholar you met in the first section has just ground his ink on a slate black stone. His brush, made from fine rabbit hair bound to a bamboo handle, is ready. His tea is still hot. And on the soft paper in front of him, a single line has been written. Only when the mind is still can the heart reflect. This isn't just a bit of calligraphy. It's a way of life. Let's take a closer look now, not just at the folding desk or the tea, but at the daily rhythm of a CNB scholar living away from court life. Because while these men are remembered today as ethical icons or academic overachievers, in truth, their lives were often filled with careful, repetitive actions, many of them surprisingly slow. Each morning began early, sometimes before sunrise, with a short walk or quiet moment of sitting. A Seonbi's first task was usually to boil water for tea. The kettle might be made of iron, suspended over a small fire. Others used portable ceramic stoves fueled by charcoal. If water was scarce, they collected dew in a bowl, or fetched it from a nearby stream and filtered it through silk cloth. The folding desk would then be unfolded. These desks, seongsa, as they were called, came in two main varieties. One was designed to sit directly on the floor. The other included short legs, offering a bit more height. Both could be packed into a cloth roll carried by a shoulder strap and set up in under a minute. Some desks had small drawers built into the underside, perfect for holding brushes, inkstones, or spare sheets of hanji, the traditional Korean paper made from mulberry bark. Others had a tiny indentation carved into one corner, used to cradle a teacup so it wouldn't slide while writing. Tools of the trade. The average traveling scholar in Joseon, Korea, carried around a small but precise kit, often handmade or passed down through generations. These included brushes. Most common were rabbit or weasel hair brushes, prized for their springy tip and control. They were stored in wooden or leather tubes to keep the hairs clean. Inkstone, usually rectangular, often made of black slate or ceramic. Scholars would grind an inkstick in small circles with water until the mixture reached a perfect consistency. Inksticks, compressed soot and animal glue, molded with floral patterns or Confucian maxims. Some sticks were perfumed to make the writing process feel more meditative. Hanji paper, smooth but fibrous. This paper absorbed ink slowly and allowed for elegant brushstrokes. Some scholars even made their own paper by hand. CNB hat, the black gat, made of horsehair, provided both shade and a sense of identity. Small lantern or candle for late night reading or composing poetry. Under moonlight, all of this could be packed, bundled, and slung over the shoulder. A library on foot. A university in motion. But what did these scholars write? More than just memorizing Confucian texts, many scholars composed commentaries, moral essays, philosophical letters to each other, and, of course, poems. Lots of poems. One common theme was the passage of time reflected in the slow boiling of water, the fading scent of steeped tea leaves, or the quiet arrival of winter wind. Another was loss, especially when a scholar had withdrawn from society. In protest or frustration, some Seonbi wrote epistolary essays, long letters meant for no one in particular. They'd begin with something like, "To the clouds, who move without purpose but never stray from the sky, ... And they'd go on to reflect on governance, ethics, astronomy, or the decay of one's favorite slippers. But this wasn't laziness. It was part of what the Joseon system called self-cultivation. This Confucian idea emphasized that morality, discipline, and clarity came not just from books, but from consistent, occasional habits. Drinking tea slowly, walking every morning, grinding your own ink by hand, these were all ways to prepare the mind for higher thought. To live ethically meant to live attentively. A scholar who cared for his brush would care for his conscience. A man who knew when to stop writing and boil water again was one who knew restraint. That's why folding desks mattered. They weren't just furniture. They were symbols of mobile ethics. Portability wasn't about travel, it was about readiness. A folding desk let you live your values anywhere. In the home, in a forest, or in a cramped guest room above a tavern. The Seonbi didn't need marble halls or royal patronage. He needed flat ground, hot water, and a few hours of daylight. And so, in the quiet hills of Andong or the outskirts of Jeonju, these scholars would vanish into the trees and reappear hours later with a freshly composed treatise, or perhaps just a single poetic line scribbled beside a teacup ring. This brings us to tea again in the Joseon era. Tea was not always fashionable. Korea had gone through waves of tea enthusiasm, especially during the earlier Goryeo period, but Confucian reforms often discouraged excessive ceremony. Seonbi scholars didn't practice elaborate rituals like those in Ming China or Muromachi. Japan, instead, they drank tea with restraint. No silk robes, no musical accompaniment, just the tea and the thoughts it brought out. Many preferred boricha, roasted barley tea, for its calming warmth and lack of caffeine. Others favored green teas from MT, Jiri, or the Bozong region. Some even mixed herbs into their brews, wild chrysanthemum, dried tangerine peel, or toasted rice. They believed tea cleared the fog of the mind. It prepared the body for long hours of sitting and thinking. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a break, a ritualized pause in the otherwise unending stream of scholarly inquiry. So imagine now, Yoon has written a few lines of commentary on Mencius. His tea is gone. He closes. His scrolls wipes the brush clean, and folds his desk back into a compact square. He slips it into its cloth wrap, slings it over one shoulder, and begins walking toward the next ridge. What did he gain from this morning? No grades, no awards, but perhaps a sliver of clarity, a better understanding of a centuries-old sentence, or a new metaphor for the ethics of governance. The life of a scholar was full of such moments, tiny, forgettable, but quietly powerful. Still, you may be wondering, how did the Seonbi balance this life of study with family, farming, or civil obligations? How did the culture at large view these wandering, tie-brewing scholars? Were they admired or misunderstood? And most curiously, how did this lifestyle continue to influence Korean thought and culture even after the decline of the Joseon Dynasty? Section 3. From Forest to Legacy. The quiet power of the Seonbi wavening has fallen. The sky above the hills glows faintly with the last light of the sun, and the trees rustle softly in the breeze. A thin wisp of smoke curls from a modest clay chimney where a small scholar's hut nestles into the side of a wooded ridge. Inside, candlelight flickers against shelves lined with scrolls and inkstones, their shadows long and deliberate. Yoon is once again seated at his folding desk. A pot of barley tea simmers gently nearby, casting steam into the air. A half-written essay lies open beside him. He's reflecting now, not just on the text of Mencius or the afternoon walk, but on a deeper question. What is the purpose of a life spent in study, away from the noise of power and progress? This is where we begin to understand the long shadow of the Seonbi life. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Confucian scholar had become a symbol in Korean society. Not merely a person, but a posture, a type, a quiet archetype in the background of the Hosing world. And yet, their role wasn't always glamorous. In fact, many Seonbi lived in poverty. They refused bribes. They turned down official posts. Some were openly critical of the government and wrote essays that circulated among reformers. Others simply disappeared into the countryside, living off small plots of land or the generosity of local families. Still, they held tremendous moral influence. Parents told their children to act like a Seonbivin. If you fail your exams, act with honor. Artists painted them with serene faces and ink-brush hands, and poets memorialized their sparse lives in verses like a bowl of rice, a single lamp, the mountains his only mirror. What mattered wasn't their wealth or fame. It was their integrity and their willingness to live out their ideals, even when no one was watching. This philosophy even bled into education itself. Throughout the Joseon Dynasty, schools known as Siwon dotted the countryside. These were not state-run academies. but privately established Confucian institutions, often built in remote areas by local scholars or clans. Each Siwang had a shrine to a revered teacher, a library of texts, and rows of wooden desks, many of seats sumi, of them foldable for daily study. Students at a Siwan might spend years memorizing classics, writing poems, brewing tea in the mornings, and reflecting on ethics in the evenings. The architecture was humble. Lessons came not only from books, but from the changing seasons. To study at a Siwan was not to race toward success. It was to settle into a life of thought. The folding desks at these schools often outlasted the students who used them, worn smooth by generations of slow, careful writing. And what of the tea sets? The scholar's tea tray, often made of dark wood or bamboo, served as a daily altar to reflection. Each peace cup, pot, tray was chosen not for beauty, but for balance. Some scholars even wrote treatises on the aesthetics of plainness. Others kept records of the water they used, measuring the taste of dew against well water, or noting which month yielded the most fragrant leaves. Even the act of pouring tea was deliberate. One Sionbi advised, "Tilt the pot as if lifting the moon, pour the tea as if filling the wind." These poetic instructions weren't about performance. They were about awareness. If you paid close attention to how tea poured, you might pay closer attention to how you spoke, how you thought, or how you governed. This slow, reflective habit made tea not just a drink, but a discipline. As Korea modernized in the late 19th century, the CNB way began to fade. The civil service exams were abolished in 1894. Western-style schools and government reforms began to replace Confucian structures. Steamships arrived. Telegraph lines appeared. The folding desk, once a symbol of readiness and intellectual virtue, became a nostalgic relic. But the spirit of the Seonbi lingered in literature, in education, and in daily manners. Echoes of this scholar lifestyle persisted. Even today, many Korean households keep small, portable tables for writing or meals, a humble nod to the practicality of the folding desk. Tea culture, too, has undergone a quiet revival, not in lavish ceremonies, but in slow moments shared between friends or family. And Confucian ideas like filial piety, restraint, and the value of quiet persistence still thread their way through Korean life, even in skyscrapers and subway stations. So where does this leave us? The folding desk, the portable tea set, the morning walks, and ink-round afternoons, these weren't just quaint habits. They were survival tools, not for war or labor, but for the inner life. The CMB knew that the world could be unjust, that politics could be harsh, that society could reward the wrong things. But by living simply and thinking deeply, they believed one could stay clear-eyed. That moral clarity, though hard to define, could be cultivated like a field or composed like a poem. Yoon, our scholar on the hillside, never became famous, but maybe, just maybe, his essays made a student think differently. His tea ritual brought calm to a stormy day, or his folding desk, passed down through a nephew or student, helped one more person find stillness in a noisy world. And so, as Yoon finishes his tea and packs up for the final time today, he doesn't rush. The folding desk folds with a soft wooden click. The teacups nest together like sleeping birds. His papers are tied neatly. The candle is snuffed. He leaves nothing behind but footprints and the faint, earthy scent of roasted barley tea. Story 2. The Ottoman Palace. Job title: Nobody Wanted. Chief Coffee Taster Section. 1. Brewing Danger: The Odd Perks and Perils of Palace Coffee. Year is 1570. You are deep inside the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Once the glittering heart of the Ottoman Empire. Beyond the heavy doors, past tiled courtyards and carved wooden screens, lies a small, dark chamber that smells strongly of cloves, roasted beans, and something metallic. In the center of this quiet room, a man sips coffee. Not leisurely, not socially. He sips with caution, with a kind of careful focus one might use when handling gunpowder. His name, his title: Kavesa Baka, Chief Coffee Taster. And this cup might kill him. You see, coffee in the Ottoman court wasn't just a drink. It was an entire institution, an aromatic symbol of prestige, intellect, ritual, and, quite frequently, suspicion that the Ottoman sultans had many enemies. Poison was a preferred weapon of political plots, particularly in the cloistered and competitive world of the imperial palace. What better way to kill a ruler than through his morning cup? Enter the Kavesa Baka, man trained not just in the fine art of brewing coffee, but in detecting the subtlest changes in taste, color, and aroma that might hint at poison. He served the Sultan directly, often kneeling with a golden tray, and sipped from the exact cup the Sultan was about to use. If he lived, the Sultan drank. If he didn't, well, the job would soon be open again. But let's slow down. Before coffee arrived in court, it began as a humble brew in the highlands of Ethiopia, and then made its way into Yemeni Sufi circles, where it was consumed to sustain long nights of chanting and prayer. By the 15th century, coffee had arrived in the Arab world and was slowly becoming popular across Islamic empires. By the mid-16th century, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, coffee found its way into the Ottoman court, first as an exotic, Curiosity, then, as an elite ritual. The palace established a dedicated coffee kitchen known as the Cove Okagi, where dozens of staff brewed small cups of thick, unfiltered Turkish coffee in brass sez pots. This was no casual pastime. The preparation of palace coffee was as precise as a military drill. Water was drawn from special cisterns. Beans were roasted in front of scribes who recorded each batch. The grounds were ground on silver mortars and weighed on ivory scales, and, crucially, every batch was tested before being served. Enter Hassan again. He had been trained from youth to detect even a trace of arsenic, bitter almonds, lead powders, or other subtle poisons. His tongue, quite literally, was worth more than gold. Of course, the role came with prestige. The Kavesabaka held real power in the court, second only to the head steward in some matters. He was trusted, seen daily by the Sultan, and could be the first to whisper important matters, assuming he survived the morning. Some even became political advisors, using their close access to influence decisions or settle quiet scores. But the role came with tension, too. The Sultan's inner circle was a nest of intrigued concubines, viziers, eunuchs, and scholars, all maneuvering for influence. If you were seen as too close to the ruler, you might mysteriously disappear. Get switched. Hazen once heard a tale of a taster who fell unconscious after sipping a brew made with spoiled saffron. He lived, but never tasted coffee again. He was dismissed with a stipend and told never to write about the incident. So why did men like Hazen accept the role? Was it ambition? Was it honor? Or was it, perhaps, the belief that tasting danger was better than being ignored? And how did the Kavasibaka train for this? How did they balance ceremony with constant threat, and did any of them ever fake a poisoning to save their own life? Section 2. Training the tongue, secrets, rituals, and the politics of sipping. Imagine the tongue as a trained censor, not just for taste, but for threat. That's what a palace coffee taster needed to master. You see, the job of Kavesibaka wasn't handed out lightly. You didn't simply wake up one day, walk into the top copy kitchens, and ask to taste the Sultan's coffee. It took years of grooming, often beginning in childhood, and the path was steeped in silence, discipline, and daily exposure to both fine things and fatal ones. Hazen's journey to becoming the chief taster began not in a palace, but in a village inn where his uncle served coffee to traveling bureaucrats. It was there that Hazen learned to distinguish between stale beans and fresh ones, between copper-brewed and clay-brewed infusions. By the time he was 12, He could tell which region a roast came from Yumani. Mocha had a fruity sourness, while Ottoman roasts leaned deeper and earthier. But no one is born a poison detector. For that, the training grew darker, the silent apprenticeship pin. The palace kitchens, the young assistants lived a quiet life of observation. Speaking out of turn could get you dismissed or worse. You learned by watching others die in the darker corners of Topkapi. Young apprentices like Hazen would be taught with carefully calibrated doses of bitter herbs, trace toxins, and antidotes, not to make them immune, but to help them identify danger. One exercise involved tasting water infused with nightshade, just enough to numb the tongue, not enough to cause lasting harm. Others involved bitter almonds used to simulate cyanide, or metallic powders that mimicked arsenic's aftertaste. More than anything, it was about memorizing sensation, the sharp edge of bitterness that didn't belong, the tingle on the roof of the mouth, the smell that stung just slightly too long. And alongside this silent curriculum came the rituals, elaborate steps meant to impress both the tongue and the court. Coffee as theater. By the time Hazen had earned the silver robe of the Kavesapaka, he didn't just taste coffee, he performed it. The process went like this. The beans were ground before the Sultan's guard. Never in private, water was drawn from a spring near a pa, believed to be pure and ceremonial. The sesva small pot with a long handle was heated, gently, never boiled harshly. Once brewed, the coffee was poured into small porcelain cups from China, set into gold or jade holders. And finally, the tray was presented by Hazan, who would kneel, sip, pause, and offer the remaining cup with 2 hands, eyes down. That pause, Akeda. It lasted 5 full breaths, enough time for the taster's face to betray any discomfort if he lived good. If he hesitated, guards would move instantly. If he collapsed well, the coffee would be poured out. The kitchen would be sealed, and the investigation would begin. The quiet perks of the job, despite the constant risk. Being Kavesabaka had its odd privileges. Hassan had access to books from the palace library. He was allowed to speak directly with court physicians and herbalists. He was sometimes invited to poetry readings or to the Sultan's private garden. He could request spices from India or brewing pots from Cairo. No one refused him because everyone feared him. Why? Because if Hazen whispered that a certain official's name had come up while he was handed a suspicious brew, well, it didn't take much for suspicion to bloom. Was it true, or was it just court maneuvering? No, but several viziers found themselves reassigned to faraway provinces after a minor digestive mishap involving bitter coffee. Hasten never said a word, and that silence bought him safety. When coffee was more than just coffee in Ottoman culture, coffee represented more than caffeine. It was a symbol of a daba, kind of refined, ethical behavior. How you brewed it, how you poured it, how you sipped these were seen as indicators of your character. For the Sultan, receiving coffee wasn't just a pleasure. It was an expression of court culture and surveillance. He watched his taster for signs of treachery. He read his face like a book, and in doing so, reminded everyone present that power, even in the form of a beverage, was to be approached cautiously. The palace kitchens operated under layers of hierarchy. Beneath the kavesabaka were dozens of aides. Some roasted the beans in rotating drums. Others fanned the coals. A few specialized in grinding alone, working with mortars and pestle for hours to get the perfect fineness. And others still were decoys officially assigned to taste the coffee, but really just standing between the Sultan and anyone who wished him harm. Hassan knew every one of them by name, and he knew which ones had disappeared overnight. So, how long could someone survive in this role? Hassan once confided to a visiting ambassador that the average kavesabaka lasted just 5 years. A few were promoted. A few retired quietly. Simply vanished, were poisoned, reassigned, or forgotten. But Hazen was careful. He never took bribes. He never drank from cups not meant for him. He rarely smiled. And he always brewed his own tea after hours, never coffee. Never from the palace kitchen. And yet, we still wonder, did Hassam ever miss a sign? Did he ever fake illness to shift suspicion? Did he grow tired of tasting every cup with fear? When he finally left the palace, did he ever drink coffee again? Section 3. A sip too far. Retirement. Survival. And the slow fade of a dangerous ritual. Hazen stood before the gate of the palace one last time. It was a quiet morning, sometime in the early 1600s. His robes, once crisp and perfumed with cardamom and coffee smoke, now smelled faintly of wool and travel dust. In one hand he held a scroll sealed with the stamp of the Hazinadar, the chief treasurer. It granted him release, along with a modest stipend and land in a small coastal town far from Istanbul, 20-3 years. That's how long Hazen had tasted coffee for the Ottoman court. He had survived 7 sultans for attempted poisonings, and countless mornings that began with the question, will this be the cup that ends me? Let's talk about that. The end of a role meant to be temporary few, kavasabaka, expected to keep the job forever. Most saw it as a stepping stone, if they were lucky. They might be appointed to manage a provincial kitchen or oversee court. Supply chains. For those who earned the trust of the Sultan, a small estate or advisory position awaited, but very few retired with their wits intact. The daily tension of potential poisoning took its toll. Many tasters developed stomach disorders, insomnia, or hypersensitivity to flavor. Some lost the ability to enjoy food entirely. A few fell into paranoia, smelling each cup of water for metallic notes, refusing meals from even trusted hands. Hazen kept a small notebook over the years. In it, he recorded every suspicious brew he'd ever encountered. 1587, bitter at the bottom, smelled of saffron, survived, but hands numb. 1592, strange sweetness, almond oil, perhaps shared with deputy, both fine. 1601, cup-chipped, refused to serve. Vizier, replaced next week. He never named names. That wasn't the point. The point was to remember, to stay vigilant, from taster to teacher in retirement. Hazen did something unusual. He began to teach, not openly, not in any official capacity, but in a small tea house on the edge of a sleepy fishing town. He set up a quiet table each morning. He never advertised, never charged, but word spread. If you wanted to learn the art of coffee, from its roasting to its reading, Hazen would show you. He taught young boys how to identify the origin of a bean just by scent. He showed old farmers how to brew without bitterness, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd lift his cup to the light, squint into the steam, and murmur, "This one, too smooth." A lie hides in smoothness. They never knew if he was joking. He never laughed. The shift in coffee culture by the mid-17th century. Coffee houses, once banned as dens of gossip and sedition, had become common in Istanbul. Poets and preachers debated in smoky corners. Chess games stretched across entire afternoons. The court's once sacred beverage was now an everyday ritual for the common man. But inside the palace, the kavesabaka still served. The title evolved. Later holders became less focused on tasting for poison and more involved in ceremony, overseeing elaborate service routines, supervising dozens of coffee apprentices, and acting as go-betweens for harem officials and viziers. Still, the ghost of danger lingered. The idea that something as simple as a hot cup of coffee could determine life or death, that never truly faded. And even centuries later, when coffee became associated with leisure or productivity, some of that old seriousness clung to the ritual toe. This day, Turkish coffee is served with quiet precision. The foam must rise, but not boil. The grind must be almost dust. The silence before the first sip remains respectful. A sip across time did Hazen ever drink coffee again after he left the palace? The records don't say, but oral legends in his coastal town suggest that he switched to herbal tea licorice, anise, sage. They say he grew vegetables in clay pots and roasted his own barley. Some claimed he brewed coffee once a year on the date of his appointment as Kavesi Baka, just to remember. He would prepare it the old way, serve himself in silence and sip once, then pour the rest into the sea. Legacy of the forgotten cup. We rarely remember the tasters of history. We remember the sultans, the poets, the generals. But the people who stood between power and danger, the ones who tasted every risk so someone else didn't have to, those stories fade. Still, their imprint lingers in ritual. Every time someone sips coffee with care, pauses before drinking, checks the heat, inhales the aroma, those gestures echo the cautious, practiced movements of men like Hazen. A role nobody wanted, a job that required silence, sensitivity, and the willingness to risk your life for the sake of someone else's pause. So the next time you sit down with a cup of coffee, maybe try this. Hold it gently, smell it with intent. Take that first sip, slowly, and somewhere across time, perhaps the ghost of a quiet man with a folded notebook and steady hands nods in approval. Story 3. Boring Greek myths for sleep. Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain. Section 1. The contest for Athens' gods' gifts. And salty surprises you are standing on a warm hillside in ancient Attica. It is quiet. A soft breeze stirs the dry grass. Somewhere behind you, the Aegean Sea glitters in the distance, calm and blue. In front of you stands a smooth rock plateau, worn flat by centuries of footsteps. This place, later known as the Acropolis, once echoed with a very peculiar argument, not between two kings, not between generals, but between two Olympian gods, Athena and Poseidon, and the subject of their argument. A city, more specifically, what it should be called, who should protect it, and which deity deserved a local fan club in the form of shrines, prayers, and festivals for all time. This is the story of how Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, got jealous of a horse and, in his attempt to impress mortals, accidentally built a salt fountain on a rock. Let's slow down a bit. In ancient Greek mythology, city names weren't just geographical labels, they were divine endorsements. To have a city named after you was a form of eternal PR. Your name would be on coins, statues, temples. Your festivals would bring in sacrifices, parades, and public poetry. So when this new settlement on the Attican Peninsula began to grow, the gods took notice, two in particular: Poseidon, god of oceans and storms, who liked making dramatic entrances on sea foam and earthquake tremors, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, weaving, and war strategy, who preferred order, calm logic, and the occasional owl. Both wanted to be the city's patron. Both wanted the honor. And neither was particularly willing to step aside. The myth says that the gods took their dispute to Zeus, who very diplomatically decided that the people of the city should choose for themselves. But rather than voting based on speeches or chariot races, the people would judge the gods by their gifts. Whoever gave the better offering would win the city. Poseidon went first. He lifted his mighty trident, slammed it into the bare rock of the Acropolis, and up sprang a fountain, not of wine, not of sweet spring water, but of sea water, salty, undrinkable, briny as a fishmonger's apron. The people were polite. They clapped. They nodded, but they couldn't really use it. Poseidon smiled confidently. He thought he had made a grand gesture. What better way to show his dominion than to bring the sea into the land? He did not expect what came next. Athena stepped forward. She knelt beside a patch of soil, and with a calm, quiet gesture, she planted something, a seed, nothing more. And from that seed grew the world's first olive tree. It grew slowly. Its leaves were silver green. Its bark twisted gently in the wind, and when it bore fruit, the people discovered something astonishing. The olives could be pressed into oil. The oil could be used for light, cooking, and medicine. The wood could be carved into tools and art. The tree itself needed little water and lived for centuries. It was, in short, useful, and so the people of the city chose Athena as their patron. The city was named Athens in her honor. Her symbol, the olive tree, would be planted in courtyards and groves across the land. And Poseidon, he was not thrilled. You might wonder why. Didn't Poseidon offer a dolphin, or fresh water, or one of his fancy seahorses that gallop on waves? Well, in some versions of the myth, he actually did create a horse right there on the rock. A magnificent, muscular beast with flowing mane and flaring nostrils. But whether it happened before or after the salt fountain is debated. Either way, the olive tree still won, which made Poseidon furious. His response: he cursed the land with dryness. He stirred up storms in the harbor. He sulked. For centuries, even today, legend says that the spot where Poseidon struck the rock with his trident still trickles salt water on the Acropolis itself. A small cleft in the stone, known as the Erechtheion, marks the place, and nearby, gnarled Olive tree said to be the descendant of Athena's original gift. Salt and olives, jealousy and wisdom, a rock and a fountain. It's a strange little myth, but beneath its sleepy details lies a surprisingly rich question. Why did the gods think that gifts would settle an argument? And how did one simple olive tree beat out the flashy drama of a god's saltwater show? Section 2. The olive, the horse, and the slow myth of civic wisdom. Let's return to that rocky hilltop in Attica. It's quiet again. The sun has moved slightly, casting longer shadows across the stone. The salt fountain, if you believe the myth, still glistens faintly with seawater. The olive tree sways in a breeze that smells faintly of thyme and dust. But the contest between the gods, Poseidon's flashy gift and Athena's modest offering far beyond that moment. In fact, it shaped the way Greeks thought about their gods, their cities, and their values. Let's take a closer look now, not at the drama, but at the meaning behind the gifts. Poseidon's offering, a horse or a salt spring, depending on the version, was dramatic, immediate, and powerful. The horse, especially, was a symbol of war, speed, conquest. Horses changed the landscape of the ancient world. They allowed kings to move armies, merchants to trade across vast lands, and nobles to display status. But they were also expensive, hard to feed, unsuitable for rocky terrain, and not particularly helpful for farming olives or surviving a drought. The salt spring, for all its grandeur, was beautiful but impractical. It could not be drunk. It did not water crops. It served, perhaps, as a reminder of Poseidon's reach, but not much else. In contrast, Athena's olive tree was slow-growing, quiet, slightly boring if you think about it. It didn't glitter. It didn't roar. It just grew. But the longer it stayed, the more useful it became. Olive oil was used for cooking, healing wounds, softening skin, and even lighting lamps. The fruit could be preserved for years, nourishing families during winter. The tree needed little water and lived for centuries. The wood could be carved into tools or furniture. In time, the olive became central to the Greek economy. It was stored in amphorae, traded across the Mediterranean, and even offered as a prize in the Panathenaic Games athletic contests held in Athena's honor. So what does this tell us? The myth wasn't just about gods competing. It was about what kind of gift endures. The Greeks, who lived in a rocky, often dry land, knew the value of resilience over drama. A city built on salt water would suffer. A city built on olives could thrive. Athens, in choosing Athena, didn't just pick a patron goddess. It made a statement about what kind of city it wanted to be. Wise, not loud. useful, not flashy, patient, not impulsive. It's easy to overlook this when reading the myth. But if you were a farmer on a hill outside Athens, or a potter selling olive oil jars in the agora, you knew exactly what Athena's gift meant. Survival. A brief note about that horse now. Let's return to Poseidon's other gift. In several ancient versions of the myth, particularly those retold in Akkadian or Ellen traditions, Poseidon didn't just offer a salt spring. He struck the earth and created the very first horse. Imagine that. A god of the sea pounding his trident into stone, and up gallops a snorting, sky-colored stallion. It's a dramatic image, to be sure. But it raises an odd question. Why would a sea god invent a land animal? Well, mythologically speaking, Poseidon wasn't just a god of oceans. He was also associated with earthquakes and stallions. His temper, his unpredictability, and his strength were symbolized by these creatures. Some myths even call him Hippios, Poseidon, the horse tamer. So his creation of a horse made sense metaphorically. It was an extension of himself, strong, wild, fast, but again, impractical. As clever as the animal was, it didn't grow food. It didn't heal wounds. It didn't shine in lamps. It didn't feed a city. It was a gift of power, not patience. Athens becomes Athena's city. Over the centuries, the myth solidified. Not just as a bedtime story, but as a kind of origin myth for Athens itself. You could walk through the city and see reminders everywhere. The olive branch, carved into stone reliefs, Athena's owl, painted on coins, the Erechtheion temple, built near the supposed site of the contest, with 2 shrines, inside, one for Poseidon, one for Athena, the Panathenaia. A grand festival held every 4 years in her honor, where winners received amphorae full of olive oil. The myth became part of the landscape. It was civic branding before branding existed, and over time it gave Athenians a quiet pride, not pride in thunder or conquest, but in a slow-growing tree and the fountain. Ah, yes, the salt fountain. You can still see its sort of. If you visit the Acropolis today and walk to the Erechtheion, there's a small fenced-off area near the north porch. Legend says it contains the sea of Poseidon, a briny trickle of water that never fully dries. Some say you can hear waves echoing from the rock when the wind is just right. Is it real? Who knows? But it's a lovely bit of mythology baked into geography. Salt water trapped on a hill hundreds of feet above the sea. A monument to a god who gave a gift that no one wanted. So perhaps Poseidon's jealousy wasn't just about losing. Perhaps it was the bitterness of being misunderstood. His salt spring and his horse weren't bad gifts. They were just wrong for the moment. He wanted to show strength, and instead, the city chose strategy. He gave drama, and they wanted durability. It's easy to imagine him storming back into the sea that day, waves crashing behind him, muttering about ungrateful olive farmers. And Athena, she likely said nothing. She didn't need to. The olive tree would speak for her year after year, harvest after harvest. But here's the thought to drift off on tonight. How many arguments in history have been settled not by might or noise, but by quiet usefulness? How many so-called losses were actually just the wrong gifts at the wrong time? And if a god can lose to a tree, what might we learn about the gifts we value most? Section 3. The tree that outlasted the sea legacy, lessons, and the longevity of boring giftslets returned to Athens, not the mythic city of marble gods and divine contests, but the real one. It's the 4th century BCE now. The Parthenon gleams on the Acropolis. Traders haggle in the agora below. Philosophers stroll under the olive trees, muttering about logic and virtue. And somewhere, quietly shaded by stone columns, a storyteller is retelling the tale of Athena and Poseidon. Children lean forward, wide-eyed, waiting for the trident to strike, for the salt water to gush forth, for the olive tree to bloom. They've heard it before, but they want to hear it again, and again, and again, because even though it's a quiet myth, it's also a comforting one. The olive tree as civic symbol. By this time, the olive tree had become more than a plant. It was a symbol of Athenian identity, that citizens prided themselves on their connection to wisdom, strategy, and moderation. The olive reflected those values. Its oil was traded across the Aegean, filling amphorae that were stamped with Athena's owl. The tree itself was protected by Locke cutting down a sacred olive without permission could result in exile. And when the Persians invaded and burned Athens in 480 BCE, they torched the sacred olive on the Acropolis, but according to legend, regrew the very next day. The Athenians took it as a sign. Athena had not left them. Her gift, slow and steady, remained, even in government. The myth echoed. The city's founding myth was often cited as a model of fair decision-making. Rather than have Zeus dictate a winner, the gods deferred to a vote by the people, rare moment in myth where mortal opinion actually shaped divine outcomes. In some retellings, the vote was almost tied. Legend says that the men of Athens voted for Poseidon, while the women voted for Athena, that the women outnumbered the men by just one. Because of that, narrow win. Some say women were barred from voting for centuries afterward. Was that part of the original myth? Possibly not. But it's an interesting way to explain cultural tensions and how myths evolve to suit a society's rules. And what of Poseidon? It would be easy to write Poseidon off as a sore loser, a god who stamped his feet when he didn't get his way. But the truth is a little softer than that. Poseidon remained an important deity in Athens. He had a shrine on the Acropolis. His role as god of the sea meant that no Greek city could ignore him for long. After all, Athens depended on ships for trade, for war, for grain from Egypt. Sailors still prayed to him. Triremes still offered him libations before departure. And that little trickle of salt water in the Erechtheion temple, it still glistened quietly, a reminder that Poseidon hadn't left. He had simply adapted in time. The city learned to balance both gods. Athena gave them olives, Poseidon gave them ports, and between the two, Athens flourished. Quiet lessons from a quiet myth when you step back and look at the myth again. It isn't just about a contest, it's about timing, fit, and the long-term value of quiet gifts. The olive tree was boring. At first, it didn't gallop, it didn't crash like a wave. But it kept giving. Even today, in modern Greece, you can find olive trees that are thousands of years old. Some still bear fruit, some are wrapped in fencing and honored as heritage. Trees, their twisted trunks are living history. No one remembers the exact horse Poseidon made, but the trees, they're still standing, and the salt fountain. Visit the Acropolis today, and you can still find the Erechtheion, with its famous porch of the Caryatodeics, elegant maidens carved in stone, holding up the roof with effortless grace. Step inside, and you'll find a darker, quieter chamber. Here lies the rock split and marked where Poseidon supposedly struck with his trident. If you listen carefully, you might hear a faint trickle, or you might just hear silence. Either way, the place still holds the feeling of a forgotten rivalry. Two gods, two gifts, one city. A final sip of the story. So, next time you're near an olive tree, pause, touch its bark, smell its leaves. Notice how unremarkable it is, and how quietly miraculous. It doesn't demand your attention. It just offers shade, fruit, wood, peace, and maybe that's why Athena's gift was chosen. Not because it impressed people right away, but because it made life a little easier year after year. So let's drift off tonight, thinking about that. About the gifts that grow slowly, the decisions that age well, and the quiet things that last longer than thunder. Even in mythology, the boring option sometimes wins, and that, in itself, is oddly comforting.